coming to terms with the wolf in Britain would be one of the biggest and bravest things we've ever done. But we desperately need to start a conversation about how we do this and when we do this and start to make progress towards attaining it as a real goal.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm sitting here with my friend Derek Gow, the great rewilder Derek Gow. Derek, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Ben, for asking me. Very kind.
Derek, you've really emerged in the last 5-10 years as one of the most important voices for ambitious restoration of nature in Britain, and also as one of the leading practitioners. You've really pushed the envelope in a number of different areas that we're going to talk about. But I'd love to start by asking you, how did this all begin for you? How did you come into rewilding?
Well, it all began for me because, when I was much younger, I started my career began in agriculture, and I was very involved with conservation of rare breeds of domestic livestock from a very early age. And then, I guess, when I was early teens, somebody gave me a set of Gerald Durrell's books, and I became utterly enthralled with the idea that you could spend a lifetime dancing with hookers in Paraguayan bars and drinking exotic beers and at the same time smoke bats out of trees and bring them back to places like Jersey to breed them in captivity and release their progeny at a time when the world was a better place. And I was enchanted by it. And eventually, I'd always been interested in conservation. Eventually, when I was made redundant, I decided I was going to go on to work in environmental education. Then I worked in zoos and ran 3 zoos which focused on native British wildlife for a number of years. And in 1990, I had the opportunity to go to the summer school in Jersey, where I met a lot of wondrous people from all over the world and realised that although they had priorities, wherever they may have been, in Indonesia, Mauritius, there were also some real issues in Britain which weren't being addressed. And so I guess my journey began at that time. I met Charlie Burrell about 10 years later and thought the man was completely mad. And then, of course, went to see some of the sites that he'd seen in the Netherlands and understood that he wasn't mad, he was brilliant. And then, I've met so many people like you, Ben, from there on in, and that's really moulded and made me what I am, for better or worse.
And when people talk about you or write about you, they say sheep farmer or Scottish sheep farmer Derek Gow. Do you think of yourself as a farmer, or did you think of yourself as a farmer?
No, for a time I absolutely was. I loved the company of the agricultural community. I worked for 5 years as a livestock auctioneer and valuer in the Scottish borders. My great-grandfather was the first person to breed a black-faced tup and sell it for over £1,000 in Lanark Market, at the turn of the 20th century. So, yeah, I had at peak probably 2,500 breeding ewes, 120 suckler cows. I was absolutely part of that, and I enjoyed it very much. But then when you start to think, the coziness of it all, it requires you put on blinkers and you just don't consider at all what's happening to anything else other than the simplisms in front of you. And when I started to farm down in Devon, because the opportunity came along, in the first few years I began, with large numbers of livestock, really hammering the ground and hammering the landscape hard. I saw the last of the curlews, the last of the whimbrels, the last of the short-eared owls, the last of the hen harriers, the last of so many things, the majority of which will never be again, that you become quite haunted by it because you know and you understand what the implications of these passings are. And for me, ultimately, the idea I was just going to keep on farming as I always had done and enjoy the folksy side of it and not act was no longer acceptable.
Most British people would see the lattice work of pretty green fields that surround Coombs Head, for example, or down through the West Country, those green pastures and those neatly cropped hedges, and they would think, wow, this is filled with nature. This is a place in which I can restore my soul and my health. People feel a sense of exhilaration, a sense of love for the landscape that we've created in this country. So what's gone wrong? How did it come to be that patchwork quilt of green fields that surround you and me in Somerset have become drained of life in the way that they have? What has that cozy world of farming gone and done?
Well, we've been draining life from the landscape ever since Britain became an island that was isolated following a tsunami off Scandinavia up 10,000 years ago. And as soon as we are the dominant species on this island and nothing can come and go, the big beasts can't migrate through a landmass or through the savannah. It was once Dogger Land where the North Sea now is. We've been killing. All the big animals die a very long time ago. Farmers come to places like the uplands, places like Dartmoor. They chop down the trees. They farm hard. It's slash and burn. And then all the goodness that is in the soil from this build-up of leaf litter and humus is washed away. And from between then and now, I think we're just beginning to realise that when you look at some of the upland environments where the sheep still are in numbers and where the forests no longer exist, that you're looking at a landscape that is just, is it nearing death? Is it still an ICU? Is there a heartbeat there? If there's a heartbeat, Ben, it's a really faint one. And you can pick your example. I mean, the other day I was speaking to a charming lady from Natural England, and she was telling me they'd just done some DNA work on the last of the ring ouzels in Dartmoor. Now, this was a common bird 50, 60 years ago. There's one pair left and one cleft in a rock face. And when you look at the DNA of what those birds are, it's a mother and a son. It's over, it's finished. And for life form after life form, you're seeing this. And what you're also seeing underpinning it, wherever you look and whatever creature you look at, is a time when the food that they require is no longer there, be it wildcats hunting rabbits to the cairngorms or eagles trying to make their way in the Western Highlands or, take your pick, berry-eating thrushes trying to fatten in a third of an acre beneath one old reservoir in Dartmoor. Everything that relied on this variable landscape with, slow-moving agriculture for food, for seed, for untidy weeds and fallow arable crops, it's all gone. Because what we've got now is we've had 70 years of chemical agriculture following the Second World War. We've had grants that came in 50, 60 years ago to drain the land and make everything more homogeneous. And with the exception in the southwest of the wet river valleys where the willow still is in abundance because it was land you could never finally drain and work. You're looking at an environment where it's very hard for most of the small and delicate and beautiful things to survive.
From reading the books you've written and from the conversations we've had, it seems to me that there were kind of three periods of loss. You've got the early loss where Iron Age communities just cut the forest and the slash and burn and the first major change in which some of the megafauna disappeared, the bears, the large aurochs and wild cattle and so on. Then the second period would have been perhaps the persecution that began under the Tudors of all the smaller predators, the bounties for killing wildcats and pine martens and eagles and buzzards and all of that killing that went on for at least 2 or 3 centuries and stripped the landscape of some of those more charismatic animals. But still, at the time of, say, the birth of my mother, pre the Second World War, you still had corncrakes in the fields, you still had abundant small mammals, you still had lots of rough edges and scrubby areas, you still had lots of life, I would say, in the farmed landscapes of pre-war England. So then the third and final plunge has really been agriculture since the war, the intensification of agriculture since the war. And the loss of species-rich grasslands, the pastures that were full of wildflowers and full of small mammals have just been replaced with these improved monocultures, improved in inverted commas, monocultures which are suspiciously green year-round. So do you think that's the right assessment, that the kind of final calamity has been really in the last few decades?
Yeah, but without a shadow of a doubt. And what you had was a whole guild of creatures that prospered, really. If you take the persecution aside and you realise that the persecution started, you mentioned the Vermin Act, starting with that, was overwhelming. Every farm had a set of traps, every individual. You didn't need to be a gamekeeper or a killer per chance. It's just what you did. And then the chemicals came, the DDTs, the poisoned whole fields of small birds, and then we infilled the ponds. If you want to just glimpse that landscape that you spoke of when your mother was young, you pick up these old ladybird books, like a guy, Ladybird Book of the countryside in summer and you look at Tunnicliffe's paintings of landscapes that are just so tantalizingly recent, where, the eels still swim upwards through Willow Carr, through kind of amber water that's clean, that doesn't run green and turgid, that doesn't smell of cow shit, where the herds of the old cattle are present in numbers. The intensification of agriculture and land use and the chemicals that have come with it that have supported vast numbers of sheep that could never have been kept without, efficient wormers, the slurries that are produced by a huge number of the pests. Everything you can think of has completely destroyed that. The bits that are left are tiny and fragile. Perhaps they're owned by the Wildlife Trust, perhaps they're owned by the National Trust. They're owned by people that organisations that are very worthy. But to come back to it and think forward as far as rewilding is concerned, it's how we remake these landscapes from things that are largely ruin to create living species that are effective now for other things.
Derek, I think what you're probably best known for has been ambitious efforts that you've led to breed in captivity some of these missing species and then to reintroduce them into the wild. You've led efforts around water voles and beavers, of course, and more recently wildcats and a whole bunch of work around individual species reintroductions. And I want to talk about that. But before we do, I just want to make the point that nature really does recover incredibly quickly. And you and I both have firsthand experience of this. And we've both felt bereft at the loss of vibrancy, species abundance, of nature all around us. We've both been privileged enough to set about rewilding a piece of land where we live. And we've both witnessed in a few short years dramatic recoveries. You sit around the fire at my place in Somerset now in the summer and you hear noise at night. You hear night herons, you hear bats, you hear the singing of tree frogs, you hear just life all around you, humming and thrumming and singing. And that for me has been one of the most dramatic changes. The other dramatic change for me has been the return of birds in winter. I always thought of winter as a time when you don't really see birds, but where we've got these great flushes of docks and thistles and so on and nettles in the summer, that's food for all the mixed finches and so on in the winter. And so we see flocks of goldfinches, 200-300 strong, forming murmurations like starlings above our heads. The recovery is so dramatic. Nature wants to burst back to life. Can you just describe for me a little bit of the joy that you've felt in the last 2, 3, 4 years at Coomshead of what you've seen changing there?
Well, there are two things. One is we've done a lot of wildflower reseeding, and along the banks of our land where the chemicals could never have been distributed. We already had swards that were rich in yarrow and knapweed and a whole range of other things. So the thing that has been most satisfying is that year on year, the strength of those plant communities accelerates. And you can now walk out, you really from April onwards, where the dandelions start with their fat, plump seeds that the goldfinches so love, in early spring. And the whole of our land in a big kind of emoji, mouth open, question, shape, it flowers. It's just, we had the guys from Exeter University came out last year and we droned it, and you go up and down that valley and that landscape is the only one that's flowering, and that gives me great pleasure. And then, the insects, the crickets, the grasshoppers, the dragonflies that come with summer, the birds that come to feed on them. And we've got stone chats back breeding again, and grasshopper warblers and whin chats moving through, reed buntings, birds that, they must have existed around the periphery of what we've done when we decided to change, but in very small numbers. And as you say, about 2 weeks ago, I was going out through the farm, and there are these aggregations of goldfinches, and a juvenile goshawk is trying to catch them. And of course, this thing is it's like trying to get a zeppelin to catch a butterfly. It's no ability to get these finches. It's way too big and way too clumsy. But, through those great flocks, you see this thing also that 20 years ago when the old keepers were here with their pheasants, that bird would have been dead. And now they're all gone. The bird's there again, and there's the goldfinches skillfully evading it. So there's great pleasure in seeing that kind of life recover. But of course, in some of these areas, there are species which can't recover because they're either too far away, or they're extinct, or they can't fly. And those are the ones that, in part, I've worked with.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. I think what's exciting around me in Somerset is I've witnessed a similar resurgence of life. With beavers moving into the valley along the bottom of our land, you now have a roughly 1 kilometre string of what seem to me like Japanese rice terraces. You know, these beautiful, dynamic, sunlit wetlands. We have glowworms back and all kinds of things. And that has had an effect on the neighbours. So even the most hard-bitten farmers now are interested in the beavers that have come back. They bring their grandkids to have a look at the wildcats that are breeding in the enclosures that you built for me. There is a growing movement to restore nature in my part of Somerset that is spreading outwards from where we are. We've got the charity Heal Somerset next door. We've got at least 7 neighbours within a mile who are rewilding some or all of their land in that way. And none of them have stopped farming. They've all got some native cattle, they've got some pigs, they're still producing a bit of meat and farming in a much gentler, lower intensity way. And food production is not going to pay the bills for sure. But I'm not sure it ever did in my landscape. It's not a productive landscape at all. I don't live in Cambridgeshire. I'm not on grade 1 arable land. If I was, I think you and I might be talking about regenerative farming and no-till and you know, how to raise crops to feed people without trashing the natural capital on which all farming depends. But it's having an effect, and more people are wanting to do this. So I think we're living in a time of tremendous optimism with the reform of agricultural subsidies and a yearning on the part of people everywhere for more nature, and change is now visible from the railway, from the train window. We go left, out of London, north, west, south or east. You see the change happening. So I'm filled with optimism. As you say, there are some species that won't make it back without our help. And some of those species are absolutely keystone. And without them, you won't get the cascade of benefit and change that we need. So, for example, beavers and wild boar and wolves, bison, those kind of animals are obviously the magic makers, and they are an essential component. But you really started with water voles. Now, how did you become the king breeder and releaser of water voles? And tell me a little bit about water voles.
So I became the king breeder of water voles by accident, as these things always happen. I was working on a project in the New Forest for sea life centres, and they wished to establish a chain of British wildlife zoos right the way up through mainland Britain as visitor attractions. And what we really wasn't realised in the beginning was they were not like fish. You couldn't send fleets of vessels out to sea, catch fish, stick them in aquaria, just do it that way. You had to obviously catch some animals to founder stock, and then you had to breed them, and then you had to understand them, and then if you were very lucky, make effective exhibits of them. But what it meant was that behind the scenes, to start any single display, you had to have very many pairs of species that had never been kept before, really, in any kind of numbers, and you had to start to understand them well. So that's where I began with water voles and pine martens and wildcats and water shrews and all sorts of other things at some scale. And it was a time in the early 1990s where you could easily go and speak to mammalogists. They would tell you that this creature was still common and they'd seen a colony here and seen a colony there. And as we tried to acquire just a very few to start our captive breeding project, you go to sites where you realise after a short time of trapping, there's actually nothing there at all, nothing. And really, I guess at the late 90s, at the earliest, people became aware that this animal that everybody thought was common had all but gone. And we now know that it's probably collapsed in Britain by about 97%. And at the time, Ben, I mean, the whole onus was on saving Ratty in his wee fore and aft hat, sculling up and down the windrush with his pal the mole, smoking his pipe and contemplating life. And what we didn't realise is just how critical the passing of these creatures is as a prey base, as an agent of landscape diversification when it comes to plant seeding, browsing, mowing the little lawns in the riverbanks, and also in the creation of their intricate burrow systems that they meticulously maintain in the provision of a living space for the other creatures of the riverbanks. So things like frogs and toads overwintering. If there are no water voles and no burrows, then that's it. There's no overwinter home. Grass snakes, you take your pick. So it's come to us slowly just how critical that the loss of these creatures are. Without them, there isn't a clean prey base in wetlands, and birds like marsh harriers cannot feed their chicks because there's no food. And then when you look at them and realise that this is where we are with this one particular species, you start to think about the lost species, things that were here like root voles, a slightly bigger animal that occupies a slightly different type of habitat to water vole. It's living in wet grassland above the tall vegetation. And then the other small voles, field voles, bank voles and everything else. You get back to your green carpets we talked about earlier on, where all you've got is blue-green ryegrass and no complication and no structure. You have most of Britain now is covered, in the pastoral areas by landscapes, where not a vole can't survive full stop, because if it's not cut 4 times a year, it's into lays that are ploughed under, or it's grazed intensively by sheep or cattle. And what this means essentially is these environments are dead. It's not even a case of they're near totally dead. They are dead. No burrows in the ground, nothing for anything to hunt. That's why you don't see your kestrels and barn owls. So the water vole was a trigger to really start thinking about this loss of food abundance, loss of process. As soon as one process stops and there's nothing there to create burrows anymore, that's it for a whole range of other small things. And then you realise that this animal, small though it is actually incredibly important in this sort of the wider cycle of life.
How many have you bred and released now, Derek, cumulatively?
Well, we don't count every single individual one, but occasionally we have a bit of a stock take and look back through the old records and have a beer and have a smirk about it. And we think we're probably heading for about 44,000 now, over the course of the time that some of us have been involved with them. Very many. And while some populations initially failed, many of the other populations, like the ones in the Gwent Levels or Queen Elizabeth Forest Park in Aberfoyle, they've created wild living populations that now occupy, tens initially and then hundreds of square kilometres that are distributed through a landscape where, with a little effort and a little tolerance, they can exist again without any great problem. And one of the principal, issues we had to come to terms with are introduced North American mink, which escaped from fur farms. But technology and our knowledge with regard to how you control them effectively has also advanced. So now we're looking at a situation that is infinitely more promising than it once was.
I'll reach out to Tony Martin and perhaps invite him onto the podcast. He's the guy that's led the eradication of mink using modern technology in East Anglia, and it's been hugely successful. And I know the government is now considering backing his ideas to roll out that eradication nationwide. But I think a softer solution is simply the rebuilding of wetland ecosystems, because the straightening of all our streams and so on and simplification of whatever wetlands we have left has effectively created a supermarket aisle along which the mink can wander and pluck out exactly what they want. And if you create a heterogeneous kind of beaver-made complex variable wetland, there are many more niches and nooks in which things like water voles can hide. And I think the evidence suggests that invasive species don't need to be as big an issue as we think they are if the habitat is good, which of course here it's not. And one of the ways to make the habitat good, of course, is beavers. And I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on beavers, even though they are one of my greatest obsessions and passions. They are the keystone of all keystone species. I have interviewed Gerhard Schwab, the great hero of beavers in Europe, and of course your very close friend, and we talked about beavers in great depth there. So I don't think we need to spend too much time on beavers, but I'd love the potted version from you as to how you came to understand the importance of beavers, why they're so important, and how they got back to Britain.
It was simple. I mean, you understood very early on that everything we did for water voles was artificial, digging ponds that silted up, cutting down willow to create open sunny environments that then regrew again, everything. There was no process which made living space for these wetland animals. And then in 1994, I went to Poland to have a look at beavers in in Białowieża National Park and in other locations, and it became abundantly obvious as you waded through these landscapes full of water with floating islands covered with orchids and resounding with the calls of multiple different frog species, that this was the engineer, this was the agent which gave life to everything else. And really, that's the simplest thing with beavers to understand, is they are the bringers of life, and they are capable of healing much of the great damage we've done if we allow them space to make their watery wonderlands. How did they get to Britain? Well, in the early 1990s, there was not even a Eurasian beaver in a British zoo. There are a few Canadians, but they're a separate species, we now know, with a different chromosome number, and they were never native to Europe. So I went out to see the guys in Poland. I went to a place called Popielno, which was an old farm. It was a state farm for beavers that was built in the time of Stalin. And with its finest architecture, it was as grim as you could possibly imagine it would be. But by God, they could breed beavers. And we persuaded them to let us have some for the zoo. And then we brought more in from other zoos. And then we brought beavers in for landowners throughout Britain, because at the time it was legal to keep them in large fenced enclosures without licenses. And all I can do is assume that some of them managed to escape out over or under the fences and establish free-living populations, some of which now are extremely large. And then later on, after much witless discussion, licenses were issued. The only license that was ever issued for a release to date, barring some of the more modern ones in Cairngorms and so on, was issued for a project called the Scottish Beaver Trial at Knapdale and Kintyre, and those beavers came in from Norway for that. So it's been a mixed bag of action that's restored beavers to Britain. But without the initial escapes and movements, nothing would have been done.
And I think it's been really a story of tremendous importance in the rewilding of Britain. I don't just mean the practical rewilding of Britain. There's probably somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 beavers now in Scotland and across the southern counties of England and up through the Wye, the Severn. They are recovering, and I think it won't be long before the government allows credible nature organisations to go about finally legitimately reintroducing beavers to catchments where they have yet to return. But so there's obviously all the practical stuff that's happened, the magic that we see with our own eyes, the rewilding on the ground that we see. But I think there's an underlying psychological rewilding that beavers have undertaken. If you stopped a random punter on the street 10 years ago and asked them about beavers in Britain, they'd think you were mad. No one even knew that beavers had once been native to Britain. People thought the North American species, no one even knew about the European species. Now, if you stop someone on the street randomly anywhere in Britain, the chances are they will know that beavers are native, that they're back, that they help mitigate flooding, and that they breathe life back into landscapes. And among the landowning community, where control of every square inch has been a kind of fetish for centuries, people have been forced to cede control and give autonomy to another species, which is a crazy idea in Britain. Of all places, it's a crazy idea that people would allow another species autonomy to manage chunks of the landscape as they will, and an acceptance that they know what they're doing, a sense of surrender, a resignation. Now, and I think that beavers have done something very, very visceral in their return to this country, and they've unlocked, I think, enormous possibilities for landscape restoration. Now, the beaver really is the emblem, psychically speaking, the emblem, I think, of rewilding. And so what you've done, Derek, I think is arguably the most important contribution anyone in the history of this country has made to nature restoration by championing the return of this species, among the other things you've done. Derek, you're also working on wildcats, and I'm lucky enough to have 4 enclosures at my place, Canwood. We've got kittens now. A bunch of those kittens and kittens from other breeding sites are going to be released by the Devon Wildlife Trust and a coalition of NGOs, and Durrell, of course, in the Two Moors project, Exmoor, Dartmoor. So wildcats, for the first time in maybe 2 centuries, will be breeding in Devon. And no doubt that's a species that hopefully is going to follow on the heels of water voles and beavers in making a comeback across southern Britain. Tell me a little bit about the wildcat. People call it the Scottish wildcat, but actually, in your view, the habitat's much better in England and Wales than it is up in the bleak Highlands of Scotland. Tell me about this species and why you think it'll thrive.
So the wildcat is its old English name is the woodcat. They were once found right the way through the British Isles. They become a particular object of ire, though we hunted them as a sport and a pastime in the early Middle Ages when the Vermin Acts come along. because this animal is an exceptionally good hunter of rabbits. And in the early Middle Ages, the mid-Middle Ages, rabbits gave you fresh meat at a time when you were otherwise eating salted, pickled or smoked meat, all of which became a bit tedious through a long winter. And they gave you furs. And because wildcats hunted rabbits very effectively, the warreners who were employed to look after them did not desire to have wildcats present in the landscape. So in one of the parishes in Devon where we're looking to reintroduce them once more, you find that between, as soon as the bounties are paid, that between 1650 and 1700 they start killing them, and they kill 303. Between 1700 and 1750 they kill 99, and between 1750 and 1800 they kill 3. And that's it. So they, like all the little animals and the big animals too, are literally wiped through the most determined of efforts from our vast island. In Scotland, there are complications because they were reduced to the worst habitat there was on the west coast. Eventually, when they come out of there, as the persecution slackens following the First World War, they hybridise the domestic cats to the point where in Scotland today, you've just got this population out with captivity of this complex revolving miasma of hybrids. There's been a reintroduction project in the Cairngorms National Park, which put out 20 cats a year ago and 10 cats this year. The cats are eating some small mammals, but you're looking at a greatly diminished prey base where there are few rabbits and not a great guild of other things. And what's happening is that to an extent, these animals are turning now to poultry and pheasants. And of course, as soon as they start to do that, you're back into issues with people. In England, you have a much broader guild of small mammals. You have species like yellowneck mice. In some places, there are still water voles. There are many more rabbits in the cliff heads and their environments where there are brown hares and grey squirrels in great numbers. And we think, on the advice of the Dutch and our German friends and others who have reintroduced this species in Europe, that the wildcats might do very well again in our cultural landscapes. They're a woodland animal that occupies territories and exists in result at low densities. And that's why we're looking to create a population that will enable us to start reintroducing cats, hopefully in 2026. And one of the things we're doing, Ben, and we haven't talked about this recently, is that it's looking very likely now that we'll start to bring in some additional animals from some of the continental zoos who have spare kittens right now that have been genetically tested for purity. So we're actively pursuing that, and hopefully we'll get the first of those in, maybe even within the next month or so.
Fantastic. I mean, imagine the magic for a young person going for a walk somewhere in England, wherever, and having the chance of looking up and seeing the blue wraith-like eyes of a wildcat peering back out of the boughs of an oak tree. Now, these animals are just extraordinary with their huge club tails and the kind of hoops around the tail. They're like the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. And it seems to me, watching them in our enclosure, that they can kind of teleport from one tree to the next. The agility and the strength of these things. I think it's a birthright thing. Someone going out for a walk in France or Italy or Spain has a chance of seeing a wildcat. And in Britain today, they don't. And they should. So I think we're restoring something incredibly important. I'm not sure you'd call a wildcat a keystone species. They obviously have their important niche, and they play an important role in driving back feral and domestic cats and thereby reducing unnecessary predation on songbirds and so on. What about the keystone predators, Derek? You just written a book about wolves, which I've absolutely loved. We got to get the wolf back to Britain, do we not?
We have to start a conversation about this animal. It's a challenge not only in terms of tolerance, it would be a challenge in terms of landscape change as well, because, of course, our system of sheep production, and everybody focuses on the deer and tells us how much damage the deer are doing in woodlands, but at best there's maybe 1 million deer rising by 10% a year. There are 32 million sheep. And if you want to get an idea of how much damage you do to a woodland, well, just take your pick of the uplands and go and have a wander through and see what trees are left. And it's nothing to do with the deer in the main, it's to do with the sheep. And of course, we've been able to create these landscapes because those predators of not actually that long ago. The more you look for evidence of the wolf, the more you begin to realize that its passing was not hundreds of years ago. It was maybe 100+ years ago, and that they clung on very long in the far north, where there were no roads and there were impassable mires, and you had a hunting aristocracy that wanted them to be there. So it's not an animal that's been gone that long, but change would mean that you have to look at your systems of sheep production. They have to come in at night or be protected with dogs and fences. And we also have to reduce numbers of them too, which from an environmental point of view would be a good thing. Wolves don't regulate the numbers of deer. What they do is they take out the sick deer, the young deer, and deer that have issues. But if we were connected to Europe still with the land bridge, those animals would be there. The wolves would have come a long time ago. They'd have moved back up to the highlands, to the old dens that are still there, that they once used, and they no doubt would have found their lairs in places like the flanks of Snowdon as well. So one, you've got the changing livestock element. Two, you've got the challenge to us. Because when it comes to it, this is an animal we've demonized for the best part of 1,000 years. And by demonizing them, essentially because they killed sheep in the church and the nobility didn't want to have that commercial influence on their activities. We took this hatred to the Falkland Islands and eliminated warres. We took this hatred to Tasmania and eliminated thylacines. And as soon as we eliminated the thylacines, we turned around, look at the black people there, and we call them fierce wolves as well, and we eliminate them too. The hatred that we started on the back of this one species has spawned a worldwide cancer of destruction that still flares up all too commonly today. So coming to terms with the wolf in Britain would be one of the biggest and bravest things we've ever done. But we desperately need to start a conversation about how we do this and when we do this, and start to make progress towards attaining it as a real goal.
And you've started that conversation with the book you've written and with the conversations you've had on television, the radio. I came to an event in Camden. You're doing a whole bunch on this. And wouldn't that be the crowning achievement, Derek, if you can be the person that brings wolves back to Britain? Because I agree with you. I don't think that Western civilization will find true harmony with nature until we find harmony and peace with wolves. It's the totemic change that needs to take place in our society, I think, if we're going to figure out how to reinsert ourselves back into the miracle of nature in the way that we've got to do if our civilization is going to have a long-term future. So bring back the wolves, I say. And I nearly got sacked from the board of DEFRA for saying that publicly. How times have changed. You can now say it quite openly. So we're the first few steps along that path have been taken. Derek, thank you so much. I'm, as you know, I'm a super fan and also feel very lucky to call you my friend. And you've been an inspiration to me. I'm really grateful finally to have you on the podcast. You should have been guest number one, really.
Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you in the long time we've known each other for all your help and encouragement. It's been an experience that's been marvellous.
I really enjoyed that conversation with Derek so much. He's a man that I love and admire in equal measure. He's been a huge inspiration to me since I first met him around 15 years ago. And he has just achieved so much for nature restoration in Britain, not just in terms of restoring species to our landscapes, but also to our consciousness. If you enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it, please do give us a like, spread the word about this podcast to your friends, to anyone you think might enjoy it. We're really growing fast now. It's working out, and we want to get these stories out to as many people as possible. Next time, I'm going to be talking to Professor Tim Coles of Replanet. Tim is going to tell us how voluntary carbon markets and the much newer but equally exciting market for biodiversity credits offer the hope of huge new funding streams for rewilding around the world. It's a complex topic, and Tim really has the gift of clarity. He made me understand how this can work and how exciting really it can be for our movement.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about the series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.